a weapon aimed directly at my daughter's head. I heard someone yell, "Don't move!" and felt my blood turn to ice. The person gripping the gun wasn't a burglar or thief. It was our neighborhood's HOA security officer from Lakeside Pines. His reasoning? My daughter appeared suspicious coming home at 10 p.m. What this man didn't realize, my daughter is an FBI tactical operations leader who has commanded some of the nation's most dangerous missions over the past 5 years, and the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Leave a comment and stay with me as I share how an overconfident HOA security guard sealed his own fate when he targeted the wrong family. I'm Michael Johnson, 58 years old, a retired diplomatic attaché who spent 3 decades navigating complex international political situations. I believed I'd encountered every challenge until I relocated to Lakeside Pines, an exclusive gated community in Connecticut that advertised tranquility, safety, and premium living. What their polished marketing materials failed to mention was the authoritarian regime disguised as a homeowners association. My wife died 5 years ago, and after decades overseas, I wanted to find somewhere serene and beautiful. Lakeside Pines appeared ideal with its manicured landscapes, crystal clear lake, and robust security measures. I had no idea that robust security would become our family's worst nightmare. My daughter Amy is 26, and unlike her diplomatic father, she chose a more action-oriented profession. After finishing first in her class at Quantico, she advanced rapidly through FBI ranks with exceptional speed, ultimately becoming a tactical operations commander, specializing in high-stakes missions and financial crime investigations. I couldn't be more proud of her achievements, though I rarely see her due to her classified assignments. When she called saying she was returning home for several weeks of rest and recovery after completing a 2-year international counterterrorism operation, I was thrilled. We'd only lived in Lakeside Pines for 3 months, and I was excited to show her our new residence. The Lakeside Pines HOA operated under the iron rule of Robert Thompson, a 58-year-old former corporate leader with delusions of grandeur, and his trophy spouse, Sarah, who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. From my first day, I clashed with their excessive regulations. Everything from the precise white shade allowed for window coverings to designated lawn watering days. But the real muscle behind these petty tyrannies was Curtis Wilson, a 42-year-old ex-police officer who'd been terminated for excessive force violations. Now serving as our HOA's head of security, he patrolled our streets like a dictator with his crew of 4 equally unpleasant officers. The confrontation occurred on a July Friday evening. Amy's flight experienced delays, and she reached Lakeside Pines around 10 p.m. I'd provided her with keys and the gate access code, but forgotten to notify security about her arrival. A simple oversight that should have been easily resolved. While waiting in our living room, I heard angry voices outside. Opening the front door, I froze at what I witnessed. Curtis Wilson had drawn his weapon, pointing it directly at my daughter's face while his partner Jason stood ready with his hand positioned over his holster. "I don't care what identification you're showing me." "You lack resident authorization," Curtis shouted at Amy, who remained completely composed despite facing a loaded weapon. "Get down immediately or I'll treat you as a hostile threat." The porch lighting cast harsh shadows across the scene, and I noticed neighbors' curtains moving as they observed the commotion. Amy stood motionless, hands visible, her expression displaying the calm that only years of confronting real danger can teach someone. She immediately recognized that Curtis held a Glock 19 and that he almost certainly lacked proper authorization to carry it as private security. "Curtis, what are you doing?" I shouted, rushing forward. "That's my daughter." I stepped between them, but Amy subtly adjusted her position to prevent me from entering the line of fire. Curtis didn't immediately lower his weapon, his face flushed with the rush of authority. "Your daughter should have registered with security," he sneered, finally lowering the gun after what felt like forever. "We maintain protocols here, Mr. Johnson. No exceptions, even for supposed FBI agents, if that claim is legitimate." Amy remained silent, studying Curtis with the focused attention of someone memorizing every detail for future reference. Only after the weapon was completely lowered did she speak, her voice controlled and precise. "Mr. Wilson, You should understand that aiming a firearm at a federal officer without justification constitutes a felony. Furthermore, I don't believe you possess proper licensing to carry that weapon as security personnel in this state. Curtis's face drained of color, but his arrogance quickly returned. This is private property. Different regulations apply here, he stated, though with noticeably less certainty. I'll be filing this incident with Mr. Thompson. Expect contact from the HOA board. As they departed, I heard Jason whispering urgently to Curtis, clearly worried about what had just occurred. I guided Amy inside and secured the door, my hands trembling with combined anger and lingering fear. I apologize for that, sweetheart. This place maintains strict security, but that was completely unacceptable. Amy set down her luggage calmly and embraced me reassuringly. It's fine, Dad. I've faced worse situations, but I think we need a comprehensive strategy for handling these individuals. That man is dangerous, not because he's skilled, but because he's insecure and armed. That's always a volatile combination. As we sat in the kitchen that evening, reconnecting over cups of tea that cooled as we talked, Amy asked targeted questions about the HOA, their operations, and particularly about Curtis Wilson. Her analytical mind was already working, connecting patterns I hadn't recognized. You know, she said thoughtfully, sometimes the most compelling cases aren't major terrorist conspiracies or bank robberies. Sometimes it's small-town tyrants abusing their limited power that deserve the most attention. I laughed, relieved to have my capable daughter home, but I had no concept how prophetic her observation would prove. The next morning delivered the expected visit. Robert Thompson appeared wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt emblazoned with the Lakeside Pines logo, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expression showing practiced concern, masking obvious contempt. Behind him stood his wife Sarah, dressed for a country club gathering rather than a neighborhood confrontation. Robert clutched a formal warning letter in his manicured hand. Mr. Johnson, he said, not waiting for an invitation inside, we need to address last night's regrettable incident. His voice carried artificial warmth from too many executive communication seminars. Regrettable incident? I repeated, feeling my diplomatic training battle with parental instinct to tell him exactly where he could place that letter. Your security officer aimed a loaded weapon at my daughter's face for the offense of returning home after dark. Nothing regrettable about it. It was illegal and dangerous. Robert's smile never wavered, though his eyes hardened. Our security team followed established protocol. Had you properly registered your guest? I interrupted him, something I rarely did in my diplomatic career. My daughter isn't a guest. She's family visiting her home, and no protocol justifies drawing weapons on unarmed individuals presenting identification. Amy appeared beside me, dressed casually but maintaining an alertness that never seemed to leave her. She placed a calming hand on my arm before addressing Robert directly. Mr. Thompson, I understand security protocol requirements. However, I'd be interested in knowing whether all your security personnel maintain proper licensing for armed duties in this state. I observed some irregularities last night that concerned me. Her tone was professional, almost friendly, but I recognized the subtle interrogation technique. Robert's smile flickered momentarily before recovering. All our staff meet the highest standards, Miss Johnson. Now, if you'll accept this formal warning, we can resolve this matter. He extended the envelope, which neither of us moved to accept. I don't think we'll be accepting that, Amy said pleasantly, but I appreciate your visit. She closed the door gently but firmly, leaving Robert and Sarah standing stunned on our porch. Through the window, I watched them retreat down the walkway, Sarah's animated gestures suggesting she was already spinning this encounter for maximum neighborhood gossip value. That was satisfying, I admitted, but probably not strategic. Amy smiled, determination gleaming in her eyes. Oh, I disagree. Sometimes you must establish clear boundaries before beginning negotiations. And make no mistake, Dad, we're now in negotiations, whether they realize it or not. Later that day, we met Linda Peterson, a 65-year-old former educator who lived 3 houses down. She brought a belated welcome pie, explaining she'd been visiting grandchildren. During conversation, it became clear that Linda represented a silent faction in Lakeside Pines, residents who resented the Thompson regime but lacked influence or courage to challenge it. Robert and Sarah have controlled this place like their personal empire for 5 years. she explained as we sat on the patio. Anyone questioning them gets buried in violation notices or excluded from community activities. Most people just pay the ridiculous fines and stay quiet. Amy listened intently, asking occasional questions that seemed casual but were clearly building a comprehensive picture of community dynamics. Over the following days, Amy immersed herself in studying HOA bylaws, identifying numerous clauses that wouldn't survive legal scrutiny. Meanwhile, Curtis began parking his security vehicle across from our house for extended periods, an obvious intimidation tactic that might have worked on someone who hadn't faced actual terrorists. I noticed other changes too. Previously friendly neighbors suddenly became scarce, and Linda reported that Sarah was hosting a ladies' tea to which I, the only single father in the community, was conspicuously not invited. Amy spent hours on her laptop, occasionally making quiet calls from her room's privacy. When I asked about her research, she revealed a disturbing pattern. Curtis Wilson had been dismissed from police force after multiple excessive force complaints, and Robert had personally intervened to get him hired at Lakeside Pines, despite his troubling record. More concerning, the security company officially contracted by the HOA appeared to be paying Curtis significantly above standard rates for his position. "Something's wrong with the finances here," Amy murmured, scrolling through public records she'd somehow accessed. HOA fees in this community rank among the state's highest, but services don't match the expenditure. The Cold War escalated when Amy encountered Sarah Thompson at the local grocery store. I wasn't present, but Amy recounted how Sarah had accidentally rammed her shopping cart into Amy's while pretending not to see her. "Oh, it's the FBI agent," Sarah had announced loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "I hope you're not investigating our little grocery store. We're all law-abiding citizens here, except for those who ignore rules." Amy had simply smiled and replied, "Actually, financial crimes are among my specialties. It's amazing what people think they can hide in plain sight." Sarah had paled slightly before hurrying away, but not before a woman in professional attire witnessed the entire exchange with evident interest. That woman proved to be Jessica Miller, a 40-year-old attorney serving on the HOA board who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Robert's leadership. She approached Amy in the parking lot, introducing herself and suggesting coffee. "Things are happening in Lakeside Pines that don't add up," Jessica had told her. "Financial discrepancies, suspicious contracts, selective rule enforcement. Some of us have been gathering evidence, but we need someone who knows how to use it effectively." As Amy related this conversation that evening, her eyes gleamed with the look I recognized from childhood, the one that appeared whenever she encountered a puzzle worthy of her talents. "Sometimes, Dad," she said thoughtfully, "you have to let your enemies think they're winning before you can turn the tables." A week later, the annual HOA meeting provided perfect opportunity to observe the Thompson regime in full glory. The community center was arranged like a small court, with Robert and Sarah seated at an elevated table, flanked by Curtis and HOA treasurer David Clark, a 45-year-old accountant who nodded vigorously at everything Robert said. We were deliberately assigned back row seats, a petty power play that made me smile when I saw how it actually gave Amy perfect vantage point to observe everyone without being closely watched herself. She had spent the intervening days cultivating relationships with several residents who, like Jessica, harbored quiet resentments against current leadership. She had also reconnected with an old FBI Academy friend, Officer James Rodriguez, who now served with local police. The meeting proceeded predictably at first. Robert delivered a self-congratulatory speech about property values and community standards. Sarah announced upcoming social events to which I suspected we wouldn't be invited. David presented financial reports so vague they could have described any organization's finances. When the floor opened for questions, I raised my hand, drawing on years of experience reviewing diplomatic budgets. "I noticed security expenditures increased 30% over last year, but there's no itemization of those costs. Could you provide a breakdown?" The room went quiet. Apparently, detailed questions weren't part of the usual script. Robert's smile tightened. "Security is our top priority at Lakeside Pines, Mr. Johnson. The board has reviewed and approved all expenditures." I persisted politely. "I understand, but as residents paying these increased fees, don't we have the right to know exactly what we're paying for?" David shuffled papers nervously while Robert's face reddened. Detailed financials are available to board members only for security reasons. If there are no other questions, he moved to continue, but Jessica surprisingly spoke up. Actually, I'm on the board, and I don't recall seeing itemized security expenses either. A murmur spread through the room as Robert shot Jessica a look of pure venom. Curtis stepped forward, positioning himself near me in obvious intimidation. The tension was palpable as Robert abruptly changed subjects, rushing through remaining agenda items before declaring the meeting adjourned. As people filed out, Sarah Thompson made a beeline for Jessica, engaging her in what appeared to be heated conversation by the refreshment table. Meanwhile, Curtis and another security guard positioned themselves near the exit, watching us with undisguised hostility. "Let them make the next move," Amy whispered as we walked to our car. "They're rattled, which means they'll get sloppy." Sure enough, as we attempted to leave the parking lot, a security vehicle suddenly blocked our path. Curtis approached my window, expression smug. "Sir, your car violates HOA parking regulations. The angle exceeds the permitted 15 degrees from the curb." It was such blatant harassment that I nearly laughed, but Amy placed a warning hand on my arm. "Officer Wilson," she said calmly from the passenger seat, "I believe you're mistaken, but more importantly, you're impeding vehicle exit, which constitutes a traffic violation." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number, eyes never leaving Curtis's face. "Officer Rodriguez?" "Yes, it's Amy Johnson. I'm at the Lakeside Pines Community Center, and we're having an issue with security personnel blocking our vehicle and making false violation claims. Could you send someone over?" The transformation in Curtis's demeanor was instantaneous. His face paled as he realized Amy wasn't bluffing about her connections. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," he muttered, signaling his colleague to move the security vehicle. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see Robert and Sarah watching from the community center steps, their expressions mixing anger and, for the first time, uncertainty. "That won't endear us to the neighbors," I commented as we turned onto our street. Amy's response was thoughtful. "We don't need to be loved, Dad. We just need to be respected. And sometimes respect only comes after you've demonstrated your strength." Back home, Amy revealed more of her discoveries. Curtis isn't just a bad ex-cop with attitude problems. He's a symptom of a larger issue. I've been examining HOA finances with Jessica's help, and there are serious irregularities. For one thing, the security company supposedly employing Curtis and his team is registered to Robert's brother-in-law, charging premium rates for substandard service. She pulled out a folder containing 5 years of financial reports. And that's just the beginning. According to these records, over $300,000 can't be accounted for. Money supposedly spent on infrastructure improvements that no one can actually identify. I leafed through documents, my diplomatic experience making patterns clear. "This looks like classic embezzlement," I said, impressed despite the situation's seriousness. "But why risk it for relatively small amounts?" "Robert doesn't seem financially desperate." Amy smiled grimly. "It's rarely about need, Dad. It's about entitlement. People like Robert and Sarah believe rules don't apply to them. The money is almost secondary to the power trip." She tapped another document showing property records. "Did you know Robert owns 3 investment properties in this community through shell companies? Properties that mysteriously never receive violation notices despite clear infractions." As we discussed potential approaches, Amy's phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Board emergency meeting called for tomorrow. R is pushing new bylaw amendments. Need to talk." Amy showed me the message, her expression turning resolute. "They're accelerating their timeline, which means we need to accelerate ours. I think it's time to bring in professional help." She made a call, speaking in the clipped, efficient language I recognized from her work communications. "Marcus, it's Amy. I need a consult on financial analysis. Civilian matter, but time sensitive. Can you come to Connecticut tomorrow?" "Perfect. I'll send the address." When she hung up, she explained that Special Agent Marcus Reed was one of the FBI's top financial crime specialists. "He's between cases and owes me a favor. With his help, we can verify what I'm seeing in these records and build a solid case." I raised an eyebrow. "A case? Amy, this is a neighborhood dispute, not a federal investigation." Her expression was serious as she replied, Dad, when people in positions of power abuse that power and potentially commit financial crimes in the process, it's exactly the kind of case that needs proper investigation. And besides, she added with a small smile, nobody points a gun at me and gets away with it. The Thompsons' response was swift and predictable. The next morning, we received 5 separate HOA violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. Our trash can was allegedly 2 inches out of position. The shade of our porch light was excessively warm-toned. The American flag I'd hung was improperly illuminated after sunset. Petty harassment continued throughout the week. Curtis or one of his men would park outside our house for hours, photographing alleged infractions. When I attempted to use the community pool, I was informed that my membership privileges had been temporarily suspended, pending review of outstanding violations. Several neighbors who had been friendly now crossed streets to avoid interactions, clearly having been warned against associating with the Johnson family. Through it all, Amy remained remarkably composed, even amused. Classic intimidation tactics, she observed as we collected the day's mail, including 2 more violation notices. They're trying to make us uncomfortable enough to either capitulate or move. Unfortunately for them, they've picked the wrong targets. Indeed, rather than feeling intimidated, I found myself growing more determined with each petty attack. During my diplomatic career, I'd faced down actual dictators and negotiated during active hostilities. Robert Thompson's suburban tyranny was amateur hour by comparison. Amy's colleague Marcus Reed arrived as promised, a no-nonsense 40-year-old with an accountant's attention to detail and investigator's instincts. He spent 2 days reviewing financial documents Jessica had provided, occasionally whistling softly at particularly egregious discrepancies. If these records are accurate, he told us while working at our dining room table, you're looking at multiple violations of financial regulations. The security contract alone is textbook self-dealing, and the pattern of infrastructure improvements with no corresponding work strongly suggests embezzlement. Meanwhile, Amy had installed security cameras around our property, not the obvious kind that would give Robert grounds for another violation notice, but sophisticated, nearly invisible devices that recorded continuously. Just documenting everything, she explained when I raised an eyebrow at the equipment. Building a case requires evidence. Her foresight proved valuable when 3 days after the HOA meeting, cameras captured Curtis and 2 other security guards conducting unauthorized inspection of our yard at 3 a.m., measuring grass height with flashlights and photographing our property. The situation escalated when Linda Peterson came to our door in tears. Sarah Thompson had cornered her at the community center, threatening to ban her grandchildren from visiting if she continued friendship with us. I'm so sorry, Linda kept saying, but my grandkids are all I have since my husband passed. I can't risk losing their visits. Amy comforted her with unexpected gentleness. You have nothing to apologize for, Linda. People like the Thompsons prey on these kinds of connections, but I promise you, they won't be in power much longer. That evening, we observed unusual activity at the Thompson residence. David Clark arrived after dark carrying file folders, followed 30 minutes later by Curtis. Their meeting lasted over 2 hours with all 3 men visible through windows, gesturing animatedly. They're panicking, Amy observed as we watched from our darkened living room. Jessica's questions at the meeting spooked them, and they're trying to cover their tracks. She picked up her phone and sent several texts, then turned to me with determined expression. Time to move to the next phase. The following morning brought the confrontation Curtis had clearly been building toward. He arrived at our door with 2 security guards, all 3 wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. Mandatory security inspection, he announced, attempting to push past me into the house. I blocked the doorway, feeling a surge of anger I rarely allowed myself to express. You have no authority to enter my home without permission or warrant, I stated firmly. Curtis smirked, holding up a piece of paper. HOA Bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 3. Security personnel may conduct inspections of any property upon reasonable suspicion of bylaw violations. We've documented 27 violations in the past week alone. Amy appeared beside me, her phone visibly recording the encounter. That bylaw clause directly contradicts state law regarding private property rights, she informed him calmly. And speaking of documentation, would you like to explain why you were in our yard at 3 a.m. 2 nights ago? Curtis's expression faltered momentarily, before hardening into undisguised hostility. You're interfering with HOA security operations. There will be consequences. As they retreated, I noticed one guard glancing back nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. That night, our security cameras captured Curtis and the same nervous guard returning after midnight. This time, their actions went beyond harassment. They deliberately damaged our garden, uprooting plants and spray painting an obscene message on our fence. When I saw the footage the next morning, I was livid, ready to confront them directly. But Amy placed a restraining hand on my arm. "This is exactly what we need," she said, voice calm but eyes sparkling with determination. "They're getting desperate, making mistakes. Each one strengthens our position." She made a phone call, speaking in the clipped, professional tone I recognized from her work. "It's time," she said simply. "We need support for the next phase." When she hung up, she turned to me with a confident smile. "Dad, remember how you always taught me that in diplomacy, timing is everything? Well, I think it's time to show these neighborhood tyrants what happens when they mistake patience for weakness." The weekend brought an unexpected sight. A group of neighbors gathered on our lawn, tools in hand, ready to help repair garden damage. Jessica Miller had organized the effort, bringing together residents who had suffered similar harassment but had previously been too intimidated to speak out. While they worked, stories poured out: selective rule enforcement, questionable fines, social ostracism orchestrated by Sarah for those who questioned Robert's decisions. With each shared experience, the group's collective resolve strengthened. What had begun as simple garden restoration was transforming into something more powerful, a community finding its voice. Among volunteers was Marcus Reed, who introduced himself simply as Amy's colleague without mentioning his FBI credentials. His presence proved fortunate when Curtis drove by slowly, clearly documenting who was associating with us. "Is that the security guard you mentioned?" Marcus asked quietly, his trained eye taking in Curtis's aggressive posture and the bulge under his jacket suggesting he was armed. When Amy nodded, Marcus excused himself to make a phone call. 20 minutes later, Officer James Rodriguez happened to stop by in his patrol car, his presence sending Curtis scurrying away. Inside the house, away from curious ears, James shared what he'd discovered about Curtis Wilson. "His file is a mess, Amy. Multiple excessive force complaints, 2 suspicious shootings ruled justified under questionable circumstances, and a domestic violence call that mysteriously disappeared from records. He was quietly pushed out of the department with neutral recommendation, which is how he ended up here." He hesitated before continuing. "There's more. He doesn't have valid license to carry concealed weapon as private security officer. The one he showed you expired last year and wasn't renewed due to concerns about his psychological evaluation. While community effort outside represented the public face of our growing coalition, real work was happening inside where Amy, Marcus, Jessica, and James were building a case file against the Thompson regime. Jessica had been secretly copying HOA financial records for months, documenting discrepancies between reported expenditures and actual services. Marcus had traced the web of shell companies connecting Robert to various vendors receiving inflated contracts. James had pulled police reports showing selective law enforcement pattern at Curtis's request. Tickets issued to Thompson critics while violations by allies were ignored. "A security company that supposedly employs Curtis and his team," Marcus explained, pointing to a complex flowchart on my dining room table. "It's registered to Sarah's brother, operates out of virtual office, and has no other clients besides Lakeside Pines. They've received over $150,000 annually for the past 3 years, but their tax filings show they only pay out about $60,000 in total wages. The rest simply disappears into offshore accounts." Jessica nodded grimly. "And that's just one example. The landscaping contract, road maintenance, community center renovations, they all follow the same pattern. Companies with connections to Robert receive inflated contracts, perform minimal work, and excess funds vanish." As our allies left that evening, garden restored and coalition strengthened, Linda lingered behind. "I've been thinking about what you said, Amy," she said, her voice stronger than I'd heard before. "They can't actually ban my grandchildren from visiting. That's not even in the bylaws. I've been letting fear control me, and I'm done with that." Amy smiled warmly. That's exactly right, Linda. Their power exists only because people believe in it. Once that belief starts cracking, she left the thought unfinished, but we all understood the implication. The Thompson regime was built on intimidation and perception of authority rather than legitimate power, and perceptions could be changed. The next day brought unexpected development. Robert and Sarah Thompson themselves appeared at our door, expressions fixed in unconvincing smiles. Michael, we feel this situation has gotten out of hand, Robert began, tone artificially conciliatory. We'd like to propose a resolution. He held out a document titled Mutual Non-Disclosure and Non-Litigation Agreement. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. We're all neighbors after all. There's no need for unpleasantness to continue. I invited them in with diplomatic courtesy, noting how Sarah's eyes darted around our living room, clearly looking for evidence of something she could report as violation. Amy read through the document with lawyer's precision, occasionally raising eyebrows at particularly audacious clauses. This is interesting, she said finally. Essentially, you're offering to stop issuing violation notices if we agree never to question HOA financial decisions or bring any legal claims against the association or its officers. She set the document down, expression pleasantly neutral. May I ask what prompted this sudden desire for reconciliation? Robert shifted uncomfortably as Sarah said, We're all neighbors. The community functions best when everyone works together harmoniously. Harmoniously under your control, you mean? I clarified, earning a warning glance from Amy, who was clearly playing a longer game. Sarah's artificial smile hardened. We've been very patient with your adjustment period, Mr. Johnson. Not everyone is cut out for community living. Perhaps if you find our standards too restrictive. Amy interrupted smoothly. What my father means is that harmony requires transparency and fairness. This agreement offers neither. She handed the document back to Robert. I'm afraid we'll have to decline. Robert's mask of civility slipped momentarily, revealing anger beneath. You're making a serious mistake. There are consequences to defying HOA leadership. As they turned to leave, Amy called after them, voice deliberately casual. Oh, Robert, just so you know, this conversation has been recorded. Threats against homeowners for exercising legal rights could be construed as harassment under state law. The door closed on their stunned expressions, and I turned to Amy with newfound appreciation for her strategic mind. What's our next move? I asked. Her smile was both confident and slightly mischievous. A press conference, Dad. And you, with your diplomatic experience and natural gravitas, will be the perfect spokesperson. The emergency HOA meeting called by Robert was clearly intended to push through new bylaws that would consolidate his power and make it easier to force out problem residents. The community center was packed, with tension hanging in the air like an approaching storm. Robert sat at the front table, flanked by Sarah, David, and Curtis, their expressions mixing determination and barely concealed anxiety. They had reason to be concerned. Amy had executed her plan with military precision, ensuring that Officer Rodriguez, Agent Marcus Reed, and a reporter from the local newspaper were all present, strategically positioned throughout the room. Robert called the meeting to order, his usual smooth confidence noticeably strained. Before we address proposed bylaw amendments, I want to emphasize the importance of community solidarity. Lakeside Pines has always prided itself on maintaining exceptional standards, which benefit everyone's property values. Unfortunately, some newer residents seem resistant to these standards, creating unnecessary division. His gaze fixed pointedly on me, but I merely smiled pleasantly, years of diplomatic poker faces serving me well. When he finished his thinly veiled attack and moved to the First Amendment, which would grant security personnel unrestricted access to all properties, I raised my hand. Point of order, I said, standing as Robert reluctantly acknowledged me. Before we vote on new powers for the board, I believe residents should be fully informed about how current powers have been exercised. There was a murmur of interest as I moved to the front of the room, placing a folder on the table. As a resident concerned about transparency, I've reviewed HOA financial records that should be available to all members but have been curiously difficult to access. Robert attempted to interrupt, but Jessica quickly seconded my right to speak, citing the very bylaws Robert had used to silence others. What followed was the most satisfying 30 minutes of my post-diplomatic career. Drawing on skills honed in international negotiations, I methodically presented evidence Amy and our allies had gathered. The security company that receives $150,000 of our HOA fees annually is owned by Sarah Thompson's brother and employs guards without proper licensing, including Mr. Wilson, who has been documented threatening residents with an illegally carried firearm. Curtis shifted uncomfortably as all eyes turned to him. I continued. The landscaping contract was awarded to a company registered to Robert's former college roommate at 60% above market rate with minimal actual services provided. As I spoke, Jessica distributed packets containing financial documents, email communications, and photographs documenting systematic abuses. Robert's face flushed with anger, while Sarah whispered furiously to David, who was beginning to look physically ill. Perhaps most concerning, I continued, is that over $300,000 collected for infrastructure improvements over the past 3 years cannot be accounted for in any verifiable projects. I believe residents deserve explanation before granting any additional powers to current leadership. Curtis moved toward me, posture threatening, but Officer Rodriguez smoothly intercepted him, engaging him in quiet but clearly stern conversation. Robert stood abruptly, voice shaking with barely controlled rage. These accusations are completely baseless and potentially libelous. This meeting is adjourned immediately. His attempt to shut down discussion backfired spectacularly as multiple residents rose in protest, demanding answers to questions I'd raised. The financial records speak for themselves, I replied calmly. If there are legitimate explanations for these discrepancies, I'm sure we'd all be relieved to hear them. The situation deteriorated rapidly for the Thompson regime when David, looking increasingly panicked, blurted out, "I just processed paperwork Robert gave me." I didn't know about shell companies. Sarah gasped in horror at this admission, while Robert attempted to physically pull David away from the microphone. The reporter was taking notes furiously, and Marcus Reed had positioned himself near the exit, anticipating what might come next. Robert, recognizing his crumbling position, changed tactics. "This is a private HOA matter being blown completely out of proportion. Mr. Johnson clearly has a personal vendetta after his daughter was appropriately questioned by security." Amy, who had remained deliberately unobtrusive until this moment, now stepped forward, expression professionally neutral, but eyes intense. "I believe residents should see exactly what constitutes appropriate questioning in Lakeside Pines." She connected her phone to the projector, and suddenly the room was filled with security camera footage of Curtis pointing his gun at her face, followed by additional footage of Curtis and his team vandalizing our property under cover of darkness. Gasps from assembled neighbors were audible, as was Sarah's moan of dismay. What happened next occurred so quickly that many residents later said they couldn't follow the sequence of events. Curtis, pushed beyond his limited self-control by public exposure of his actions, lunged toward me with a roar of rage. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon, and several people screamed in alarm. Before anyone else could react, Amy moved with fluid precision of her tactical training, intercepting Curtis and disarming him with a series of movements so efficient they appeared almost casual. One moment, Curtis was charging forward with murderous intent. The next, he was face down on the floor, his own handcuffs securing his wrists behind his back, Amy's knee placed precisely between his shoulder blades. Officer Rodriguez immediately took control of the subdued Curtis, officially arresting him for assault, illegal possession of concealed weapon, and making criminal threats. As Curtis was led away, still shouting obscenities, Robert made a desperate dash for the exit, only to find Marcus Reed waiting with identification in hand. "Robert Thompson, I'm Special Agent Marcus Reed with the FBI. I'd like to ask you some questions regarding financial discrepancies in the Lakeside Pines Homeowners Association accounts, particularly offshore transfers from allegedly legitimate vendor payments." As Robert was escorted out for questioning, gathered residents sat in stunned silence for several moments before erupting into chaotic discussion. Jessica quickly took control of the meeting, her legal training serving her well as she calmed the crowd and established an interim leadership committee to manage HOA affairs until proper elections could be held. Sarah Thompson, abandoned by her husband and suddenly facing the collapse of her social standing, fled the room in tears. David, looking simultaneously terrified and relieved, voluntarily surrendered all financial records to Officer Rodriguez, apparently hoping for leniency through cooperation. When dust settled and the community center gradually emptied, Amy and I walked home in warm evening air, strange sense of peace settling between us. Was all this really necessary? I asked her, genuinely curious about her approach. Couldn't we have just reported Curtis for brandishing a weapon that first night and been done with it? Amy considered the question thoughtfully before answering. We could have, but that would have addressed only a symptom, not the disease. What was happening in Lakeside Pines wasn't just about one bad security guard. It was about systemic abuse of power that affected everyone. She smiled slightly. Besides, I'm trained to look at the bigger picture. One rogue security guard is a police matter, a coordinated scheme to defraud homeowners while using intimidation tactics to silence opposition. That's something worth dismantling properly. As we reached our house, a reporter who had followed us from the meeting called out, asking for a statement. "Who exactly are you, Ms. Johnson?" she inquired, notebook in hand. Amy simply smiled. "Just a homeowner who knows her rights," she replied before guiding me inside and closing the door on the next chapter of what was sure to become Lakeside Pines' legend. 3 months passed, bringing remarkable changes to Lakeside Pines. Criminal investigations proceeded with methodical thoroughness, resulting in multiple charges against Robert for embezzlement, fraud, and financial misconduct. Curtis faced separate charges related to illegal weapons possession, assault, property damage, and harassment. Small local newspaper coverage of the HOA corruption scandal was picked up by larger outlets, bringing unwelcome publicity to former leadership, but ultimately beneficial transparency to the community itself. Sarah Thompson, faced with mounting legal bills and collapse of her social standing, quietly listed their house for sale and moved in with her sister in another state. David Clark, the treasurer who had enabled financial misdeeds, cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, providing detailed testimony about how Robert had manipulated HOA finances for years. The security company was disbanded, replaced by a legitimate firm with properly licensed personnel who understood their limited authority. The most profound change, however, was in the community itself. Jessica Miller was elected as new HOA president, with Linda Peterson serving as vice president. Their first official acts included revising bylaws to ensure transparency, establishing reasonable enforcement procedures, and reducing exorbitant fees that had funded the previous regime's excesses. Community events became genuinely inclusive rather than opportunities for social hierarchy enforcement, and neighbors who had previously avoided each other now stopped to chat while walking dogs or collecting mail. One evening, as Amy and I sat on our porch enjoying the sunset before her departure for a new assignment, Sarah Thompson unexpectedly appeared at our gate. She looked drastically different, her designer clothes replaced by simple jeans, her carefully maintained appearance now showing signs of strain. "May I speak with you?" she asked hesitantly. I glanced at Amy, who nodded slightly and invited Sarah to join us. She declined the offered chair, standing awkwardly as she struggled to find words. "I wanted to apologize before I leave permanently," she finally said. "I knew about some of what Robert was doing. Not all of it, but enough that I should have spoken up. I convinced myself it wasn't hurting anyone, that it was just the way things worked." Amy regarded her thoughtfully. "Why did you participate in it, Sarah?" "You must have known it was wrong." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "You have to understand. My entire identity was wrapped up in being Mrs. Robert Thompson, the Queen of Lakeside Pines. I was nobody before I married him, just a receptionist from a small town. The status, the respect, the envy of other women. I became addicted to it." She looked down at her unmanicured hands. "Now I'm starting over at 55 with nothing but alimony and regrets." I felt a surprising twinge of sympathy for her, recognizing the universal human desire for significance that had led her down such a destructive path. After Sarah left, Amy and I decided to host an impromptu barbecue, inviting neighbors who had stood with us and others who simply wanted to be part of the community's fresh start. As twilight descended and conversations flowed freely across my once scrutinized lawn, Jessica pulled me aside. "Your daughter is remarkable," she said, watching Amy chatting easily with a group of residents. I've learned more about leadership from watching her these past months than in my entire career. She never sought credit or control, just justice and proper order. The community will miss her. I nodded, feeling familiar mixture of pride and wistfulness that came with having a daughter whose extraordinary capabilities meant she was often called away to where she was needed most. Later that night, after our guests had departed and the house was quiet, Amy and I sat on porch steps with glasses of bourbon, enjoying our last evening together before her early morning flight. "I've been thinking about what you did here," I told her, the liquor loosening my typical reserve. "You could have handled Curtis personally that first night and been done with it. Instead, you orchestrated complete community transformation." "Why?" Amy considered her glass thoughtfully before answering. "Growing up watching you work, I learned that true diplomacy isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about transforming it into something constructive. Curtis pointing a gun at me was just a symptom of a toxic system. Removing him alone would have solved nothing." She gazed out at the peaceful neighborhood where porch lights twinkled like earthbound stars. "The strategy wasn't about revenge, Dad. It was about restoration. Communities like this one should be places where people look out for each other, not fear each other." I understood then what had motivated her patient, methodical approach. It wasn't just the tactical commander in her that had responded to the threat, but the community builder, a quality I hadn't fully appreciated until now. "I've spent my career dismantling threats," she continued quietly, "but there's something uniquely satisfying about building something better in the aftermath." As dawn broke the next morning and I prepared to drive Amy to the airport, we received a stack of thank you cards from neighbors, many of whom we'd barely known 3 months earlier. "Will you be all right here without me?" Amy asked as we loaded her luggage into the car. "What if some other security guard decided to throw his weight around?" I laughed, feeling more at home in Lakeside Pines than I had since moving in. "I think I can manage. Your old man still has a few diplomatic tricks up his sleeve." As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the house that had transformed from a site of conflict to a true home, and beyond it to the community that had found its voice. "You know," Amy said thoughtfully as we neared the airport, "there's a philosophy I've developed over my years in tactical command. Sometimes you don't need to fire a weapon to win a battle. Sometimes understanding the game your opponent is playing and turning it to your advantage is the greatest victory of all." She smiled at me, rising sun illuminating her profile. "And sometimes the most peaceful communities have weathered the worst storms. Since that incident, whenever an HOA in Lakeside Pines or beyond considers overstepping its authority, the story of the FBI commander's daughter and her diplomatic father is often recalled as a cautionary tale. Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they simply understand their rights and refuse to be intimidated. And perhaps the most important lesson? Never point a gun at someone when you don't know who they are, especially if that person happens to be an FBI tactical commander, with a gift for strategic thinking and a deep commitment to justice." Video description: what happens when an arrogant HOA security guard decides to threaten the wrong person? When Curtis Wilson pointed his weapon at what he thought was just another suspicious resident, he had no idea he was facing off against an FBI tactical commander with years of experience in high-stakes operations. This is the incredible true story of how my daughter Amy, a decorated FBI agent, methodically dismantled an entire corrupt HOA regime that had been terrorizing our upscale Connecticut community for years. What started as a simple case of security overreach quickly evolved into uncovering a massive embezzlement scheme, illegal weapons violations, and systematic abuse of power. Watch as a retired diplomat and his FBI daughter use strategy, patience, and the law itself to bring down neighborhood tyrants who thought they were untouchable. This story proves that sometimes the most satisfying victories come not from confrontation, but from letting your enemies destroy themselves.